Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products.
Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Fred Hall, Western Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and I'm joined here by my Extension Dairy colleagues, Dr. Gail Carpenter, who's the Assistant Professor and State Extension Dairy Specialist, and Dr. Phil Jordan, Extension Dairy Veterinarian, as we discuss part 2 of our series on high-path avian influenza as it pertains to dairy cattle. Welcome back to the team.
Happy to be here, Fred.
Thank you, Fred.
Today we are joined on the podcast with David Marks, USDA Wildlife Services. USDA Wildlife Services is a federal program intended to help agricultural landowners and municipalities deal with wildlife conflicts, especially with wildlife that pose a disease threat to humans or agriculture, like feral swine, or with the wildlife protected by federal law, including migratory birds like the Canadian goose. Welcome to our podcast, Dave. And before we start our discussion, tell us more about you and your position with Wildlife Services.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. So I am the Assistant State Director for Wildlife Services for the Missouri and Iowa program. So both those states are grouped as one in Wildlife Services. So we cover Missouri and Iowa and deal with wildlife conflicts in those two states. And one of the biggest issues that we're working on these days is high-path AI. And we have a pretty large project that's new, where we are working with the poultry industry to basically conduct wildlife assessments on their farms, and then also like what hazards are attracting water or wildlife to their facilities and how to keep them out of the barns, and then also actually conducting direct control, where we are actually physically removing or harassing, dispersing birds from those facilities. So that's kind of the hot topic of the day, I guess.
Absolutely. As mentioned in the previous podcast, it's been announced that high-path has been detected in dairy cows in several states, including Texas, Kansas, Michigan, Idaho, and New Mexico. Now, I want to remind everybody that this is an evolving topic. We learn a little bit more every day where it's spreading and the effects on dairy cattle and the transference from one species to the other. We also know that migratory birds play a role in this transmission, and how producers might consider management practices to reduce this transmission through birds and other wildlife is kind of the topic for today. So we'll start with some questions. Wild migratory birds are believed to be the source of infection. Is it the same strain affecting wild birds, commercial poultry, and some other wild animals? That's probably a Dr. Jordan question.
Well, it's seems to be a very similar strain anyway, but it's still kind of early to tell. And there's still some argument over what it should be named, because this was found in a cow, but it's certainly very similar to what was found in birds.
Yeah, so basically wild birds, and specifically waterfowl, are the natural reservoir for all avian influenza strains out there. So you might have heard of all these different H's and N's. Every single one of them can be found in wild birds. And since about 2000, since about 2005, this H5N1 that we've been hearing about first kind of showed up in Asia, and since then it's kind of spread through Asia and Europe, and then just most recently jumped over to North America. And so this is the H5N1 from Asia that originated in 2005 is now here. And we're finding it in hundreds of different species now. So waterfowl are the natural reservoir. They don't typically get sick from any avian influenza. This one is a little unusual that it will actually kill waterfowl every now and then. It's still not very likely, but they are the main host. Then it can be transmitted to all these other bird species and actually mammals. And now what we're seeing is that, it actually spilled into some cattle. So they're all H5N1, but they're, it's one of those viruses that is highly mutatable. It's mutating all the time. Basically, every time it replicates in a body, it mutates a little bit. So there's a lot of variation out there. And this one, I'm not even sure of all the genetics yet, but it is for sure the H5N1 that has been brought here from wild waterfowl. It's just a matter of how related it is, how much it has mutated. If that makes sense.
Yep. So we know that migratory birds or migratory waterfowl are a source. Do we know, because they fly south and then fly north, is it originating in Mexico or originating in Canada? Do we have any idea on, where it actually started in this country?
Well, so it started, like I said, over in Asia, and it's literally the same strain. It's been circulating, and as these birds migrate, one of the things that we've been watching for years, since 2006, really, we started testing waterfowl, because some of those birds in Asia fly north to breed in Alaska and, Canada, northern Canada, and then our species do the same thing, right? And so they intermingle, and that was always kind of what we were looking for, is like there was a potential there that they could mix, and one of our species would get it from the Asian species and bring it back through the United States, when they migrate south for the winter. And so basically that's kind of what happened in 2022. In the spring of 22, February, we started seeing a couple, and then March is when it really hit hard. And then basically since then, it's been self-sustainable. It's been replicating in our native waterfowl. So it's basically been in our continent since 2022.
It seems that there's a lot of species that are susceptible to influenza viruses, including the wildlife that often come in direct contact with wild birds. Can you kind of help us out with the vectors of how wild birds exposed to the virus and then farmstead birds pick it up?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the waterfowl are basically the reservoir, and again, most of them don't even get sick. So in those waterfowl, the replication of it is actually, it's not really even a respiratory disease. It's a more of a fecal oral route. So a lot of these ducks that we see, they're the highest prevalences, the dabblers, because they go in the water and they get in the shallow waters and they eat and they poop, and the next one comes by and they eat the virus and it replicates, and it's a cycle like that. So basically it's in the water is the issue, so that's when, like say Mr. Pigeon comes by and he needs some water, he goes to the pond and gets a drink of water. He's been exposed to it. Now it's not really adapted to pigeons and starlings and these other birds, but it does happen. Like I said, this virus itself is constantly mutating. There's always little variations, and it's just like, humans and normal flu. Some people are more susceptible, some people are pretty resistant, right? So your own body is a factor of how if you can become infected. But we know that, a very, very, very low prevalence, but it can happen where these other species can get that from the water, And then they're the ones that are bringing it to the barns then, you know, like the pigeons, starlings, sparrows, swallows, robins, killdeer, the typical species that you see on your barn. Again, they're not the main reservoir. They're not going to probably replicate it and keep it going in the environment, but they're, you know, potentially bringing it to the farms. And furthermore too, you know, like the virus itself, if it's wet and not in sun, it's pretty fragile. If it's dry and in the sun, it will die. Sunlight and dryness will kill it. But if, again, say a swallow goes there and goes to the water, does a little bird bath, splashes water all over its feathers, comes back to the barn, and you know the virus can survive on the body of the bird. It doesn't even necessarily have to be positive, you know, replicating infected. Where you know if that bird goes into the barn, a feather falls off, Mr. Cow comes by and you know, sniffs the feather or eats the feather, ingests it somehow. That could be another potential way, just as a fomite. Be like a person walking through the water with their boots can bring it into the barn, something like that. So there's multiple ways that it can happen. You know, it's obviously lots of variables, lots of unknowns, but it's just basically the potential's out there. So basically, in my mind, we consider wildlife a potential vector, you know, whether they have it or not. It's just better to be safe than sorry.
So how pathogenic is it to some of these native species? You mentioned sparrows and starlings and pigeons. Is there usually some death with those with high path avian influenza?
There is and there isn't, and it's again that's one of those things that we really are looking at. We don't know. I mean, I can say that we are testing birds. Wildlife Services, we're testing primarily still looking at waterfowl to get an idea of where it is on the landscape and if it's moving north, if it's moving south, and where it's showing up. But every single sample we take is going to NBSL. Every positive basically is confirmed there, and then they do a genetic analysis on them and look at how it's related to other ones and how it's related to poultry. And I'm sure these cattle samples are going to be included into that tree and see how they're related, and that's what they're working on right now. I just from personal experience, I know we've had a couple positive house sparrows that I tested in Iowa, and they were showing signs, and actually 2 of them I found dead. So it did look like it did kill the house sparrows, but some of these other ones that they're testing are apparently healthy as well. So there's a lot of unknowns, but it does seem to be more like show higher pathogenicity to non-waterfowl species. And I guess that also reminds me, you might have heard of some of these other mammals like raccoons and fox and coyotes and seals and also like raptor species like eagles, vultures even. A lot of those are dying from the disease, and we find them dead. And what we think is going on is that all those mammals and those raptors are basically scavenging the dead, like a dead duck or something else that had AI, that died of AI. And then, you know, Mr. Fox comes by and eats it. We've also had some feral cats test positives, but they're like eating a dead carcass that has died of AI, you know, and getting a full, very large viral load. And those are actually, you know, most of those scavengers and predators we're finding have died from it.
Okay, what are some of the ways dairy producers can limit exposure from the migratory bird standpoint and these secondary infection of mammals?
Yeah, so basically, you know, how we treat the poultry farms. Obviously, they're a little bit different because they're obviously more confined. Like the poultry are confined within a barn, a lot more than cattle, right? So for us, the main priority is keeping those barns tight and making sure birds can't physically get in, stuff like that. Now, for the dairy industry, you know, a lot of them are open air, right? Birds are coming in and out. So basically, the strategy that I would take there is to just basically reduce your reduce attractants, wildlife attractants, and literally reducing populations of the of the non-protected species, like the invasive species that are not protected, which are, feral pigeons, European starlings, and European house sparrows. Those are all invasive species that are not protected, that you can lethally remove from your farm. But the attractants are probably the bigger thing. Like water, in my mind, is the worst thing you can have, because going back to waterfowl, right? Waterfowl love water. That's the reason they're going to come in. The virus loves water. It can survive in water for months if it's cold and out of the sun. So it's basically like, if you have water on your farm, consider that potentially positive. And then if there's any way, if it's just standing water, can you drain that? Can you put a drain tile underneath it? Can you create a dike or berm or somewhere to get it drained? If it's a full pond or permanent water source, you can keep an eye on it, as far as like, if you see, every time you see waterfall on there, go out there and scare them off. There's things you can do, like pyrotechnics, lasers. Birds don't like lasers. You can actually install a grid system of wires over the top of your pond. We've done that for some of these commercial poultry farms, where you basically string high tensile fishing wire across every 5 feet and create a grid over that pond. And the waterfowl they need kind of a runway to take off and land, so they can't get in and out. So that's a very effective long-term solution, is to create a grid. Obviously, it takes some effort and funds to do that, and maintenance, but that is one of the long-term recommendations we make to keep waterfowl out. Any kind of food sources other than the water, if you have spilled feed, clean that up as much as possible. Again, if you're talking about starlings, especially in the wintertime, we actually have a program already in place where we work with dairies across the state, that if they have these, a lot of times in the winter, those starlings will flock up in the thousands, and they need food. So they're coming into the barns and literally eating in the barns with the cows, right? And pooping everywhere, right? We do it for other reasons too, salmonella and E. coli and all these other diseases, right? And it just, they're eating the fat nuggets out of the feed, so it's dropping milk production. So we do have a pesticide program for starlings in the wintertime, where we can come in and work with the farmer to get them on our bait and then safely where the cows can't feed. And then we come back with a pesticide and basically do a hot treatment, and basically remove sometimes over 95% of the starlings in one treatment, depending on how well they're eating that bait. So there's a variety of different things, but basically you want to keep wildlife away. I should mention, that you already did mention it, but basically any bird that's not an invasive bird, even robins and swallows, all those birds, including waterfowl, are all protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So they are protected. It is illegal to do any harm to them. You can't shoot them, you can't harm them, you can't destroy nests without permits. So you would need to do all harassment, or if it's a reoccurring program, you could work with us to try and get a limited permit to maybe do a little bit of lethal control on some of the species. If they're truly causing damage, it's a whole separate process.
So how does a producer, do they contact you or contact IDOLS, or how do you start the procedure to access some of these resources?
Yeah, so they can contact us directly. For basically, we can offer advice, what we call technical assistance, education, over the phone. A lot of it we can if a producer can kind of describe the situation, we can kind of give them ideas. We can also do site visits, stuff like that. I should mention that if we get involved as far as like actual doing boots on the ground work, like the pesticide control, or helping do harassment or removals, right? We do have to get reimbursed for that cost. There's no federal funding for this at all. Where Wildlife Services has some federal funding, but primarily we are cooperatively funded. So like if we work for a producer, we have to get reimbursed for that cost. So I just want to be upfront that there might be a charge if depending on how much you want us to do, basically. The more you want us to do, the more we'd have to charge. But yeah, they would just give us a call. We can give my number here, or the main central office number here. Yeah, so our district office number is 515-414-3292. And that, basically, that's our central number for everything. So just got to explain the situation and what kind of help you're looking for and what's the conflict. And we can kind of walk you through it and walk you through the next steps of whether you just want advice or if you want us to actually come out and do some physical work on the ground.
So Dave, can you tell us some more about the starlings? I've always been interested in how they're, I hear they're not native. They're native to Europe, I think. And that
Yep.
they're the way they nest and stuff makes them so that kind of nobody likes them. Farmers and wildlife people both. Is that true?
Yeah, they're truly an invasive species. So for those of you that don't know, there's kind of two terms. There's non-native species and then there's invasive species. So non-native just means it's not from here and it was brought here and maybe even intentionally, but there's really nothing wrong with it. So like a pheasant, everyone in Iowa, likes to go pheasant hunt, right? So those are not native. They're not from here. They're actually from Asia. They were brought here intentionally, but they don't cause any harm to the environment or economic damage or anything like that. So they're just non-native. Where starlings, pigeons, and European house sparrows are considered invasive, meaning that they're not from here, and they cause some sort of damage, either economic or natural resource damage. And starlings in particular, the big problem with them is they flock up in the thousands, right? Like you see these big swarms of starlings, and they out west where they do sunflower seeds, they can destroy a flock overnight. In Iowa, we get calls from dairies and feedlots where it's, like I said, in wintertime, it's usually the issue is that because they're flocking, they're looking for food and they group up and they come in and eat all the high protein nuggets or the fat nuggets actually that farmers actually add to the grain to increase production. The birds actually pick those out, and they're spreading diseases. And then, like you mentioned, they're also even birders don't like starlings because they can overtake a lot of nest boxes, in particular the eastern bluebird. A lot of people like to make eastern bluebird nests, and they're a species they're not of concern or anything, but they are in decline. Kind of a slow decline, and starlings are known to take over bluebird nests. So basically, there's no protections on them. You can, lethally remove them at will, and there's no repercussions for it. So,
All right. So are there ways to? I know I've seen those spiky things sometimes that keep the birds from landing. I don't know what their official name is. Are those effective? What's that?
Bird spikes is that's a so, but yeah, so there are a variety of things on the market, and basically everything is a tool in the toolbox, right? So there's no magic bullet that'll just answer all your prayers and all your birds will be gone, right? The bird spikes in particular, there's a lot of different types out there. A lot of them are really cheap and, in my opinion, don't do much good. In fact, I've taken pictures myself of pigeons and starlings, like literally building their nests in the bird spikes. But there are some more expensive ones that are really super sharp, and they seem to be a little bit more effective. But again, it's a pretty big expense, and they're not always effective. Netting is another option, bird netting, and that can get pretty expensive. And it has to be done well. Like you have to have a professional come in that has done it multiple times, because you literally have to tack that thing down so there's no gap more than an inch. Otherwise the birds will get in. And those things, they will, just open air. If they're open air, there's gonna be wind. They get damaged. And then the thing is, we find that people install them and never maintain them. So as soon as that thing gets a hole in it, then the birds can get in, and you actually created more habitat for them, because now they can get in and they get behind the net and they're actually more protected. They feel good and they can build their nest in there. So Everything has a kind of a pro and con. There's lasers out there that work really well. There's some really super expensive ones that are automated and kind of like a robot laser that you can program and you can cover all the areas of the barn. Those can be effective, but they're more expensive. But again, you kind of have to cover every area, otherwise if you don't get to one area, the birds are going to find that area. They're pretty smart. So we find, like, when we're doing our work, boots on the ground with like poultry farmers, for example, or ethanol plants, we use a lot of different tools. You got to keep changing up your methods. Again, for those pigeon starling sparrows, we do a lot of pellet rifle work. I know it sounds like a lot to remove a bunch of starlings with a pellet rifle, but it is effective if you just keep at it and spend a lot of time doing it. And also, it has an added effect that, it's also harassment, like you might shoot one and the whole flock flies away, right? So you just got to keep at it, and eventually they get the idea. So that's kind of the name of the game for anything kind of wildlife mitigation, is that you got to be creative, change up your tactics, use multiple tactics, multiple times of the day, and just keep at them. That's all you got to do.
Well, I have a question about natural predators. I remember being at a dairy once and commenting, I don't see any starlings around here. I was just surprised there weren't any that time of year. And he said, yeah, that's because my workers noticed there's a hawk that's nesting up here. And that's when that hawk moved in, nobody, the starlings didn't want to even come close. So is there something we can do with that, either natural or those fake owls? Do they really work?
The fake owls do not. Okay. The balloons, the fake owls, anything that you think you're going to just set out there and scare them, it might work for a day or two, or even maybe a week. Those audio distress calls, same thing. Basically birds are smarter than we think, and they figure it out. Like, hey, that owl hasn't moved in 3 days. And again, I got pictures of birds building a nest on top of an owl, a fake one. But real owls, yes, and real raptors. There's different species that actually eat birds versus mammals. They can be effective, but there's really not much you can do about it. You might get lucky, and those birds are just going to kind of usually pass through too. It's not going to be like a permanent solution. We've even had areas like ethanol plants that we've worked with, put up a peregrine falcon nesting box, which is good for multiple reasons, because you're promoting a peregrine falcon, which is, again, it's not endangered or anything, but it's one of those species that were in decline, and they're coming back a little bit now. But it's good PR. You can put up a nest box, and if they take up residence there, yeah, you're gonna see some effect on that. Now, it's not going to get rid of all your birds, because just like any predator prey, they're not going to eat all the prey, so they don't have anything to eat anymore. And they eat like one bird a day, So, but just having them around will reduce the overall numbers. Again, just another tool in the toolbox, the way I look at it.
As we're closing down today's program, what's the take-home message you want to leave producers with, David?
I think, just, I know AI is a hot topic now, and obviously with what's going on right now, it's very, very concerning. Not everything is known, but just in general too, there's other diseases that, like I mentioned with the starlings, Salmonella, E. coli. There's actually been some research shows they could transmit yonis. It's just a good idea, as a One Health approach to your herd, just to practice good biosecurity practices, and which would include wildlife control, wildlife management, and I know dairy farms are a lot harder to control as far as biosecurity compared to like a contained, like poultry flock or a contained swine farm. You have bigger issues because it's open air, right? But that doesn't mean you can't do anything, right? There's definitely ways that you can reduce your wildlife presence on your farm, and we can help you figure that out.
Well, we'd like to thank you, David Marks, with the U.S. Department of Agriculture Wildlife Service, for talking with us today about the effect migratory birds or the relationship of migratory birds and the high path we're experiencing on dairy farms right now. This is closing out for Dairy News and Views from the Iowa State Dairy Team. Thank you for assisting me, Dr. Jordan. Thank you, David Marks, for being our presenter today. And we'll look forward to having people join us for the next Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.